In this set of 5 lessons, students will learn about a crucial time period in Filipino-American history. This period, from 1898 to 1946, included the first large waves of Filipino immigration, particularly between 1917 to 1934, and the beginnings of the labor movement in the United States. Filipinos were forced to take low-paying jobs as farm laborers and cannery workers on the West Coast that resulted in discrimination and anti-Filipino riots. As a result of these industries, vibrant Filipino enclaves emerged, particularly on the West Coast in San Francisco and Stockton. Due to the Philippines' colonial status, a different community emerged in the Washington, D.C. area, as Filipinos immigrated to the U.S. capital for government and military jobs. And finally, at the end of this period, Filipinos played a crucial part during World War II as members of the U.S. Army.
At the end of these 5 lessons, students will be able to explain how the patterns of Filipino migration to the United States were determined largely by immigration laws and government policies, provide an overview of early Filipino American experiences, and explain why the military is so central to Filipino American experiences. By highlighting the history and culture of Filipino American communities, as well as the challenges resulting from U.S. colonialism and discrimination that they have endured, these lessons will help students develop a deep appreciation and respect for these communities and their indispensable contributions. The first of these lessons focuses on migration from the Philippines to the U.S. in the early 20th century, especially between 1917 to 1934. Students will learn how the United States labor market affects immigration laws and policies. In particular, the different waves of Filipino migration after the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1898. The lesson will pay specific attention to the Immigration Act of 1917 and the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934, also called the Philippine Commonwealth and Independence Act. Students will learn the meanings of the terms pensionado and menong. During this period, Filipino Americans also started to use the word Pinoy to refer to themselves and their culture. The term is still in use today. The lesson begins with a reading of the poem Prophets Enslave the World by famous Menong, Filipino labor organizer and pioneer of the Asian American movement, Felipe Veracruz. There are also 2 activities that focus on the Tidings-McDuffie Act. The first features the private journal of Mr. Julian Garcia, a naval bandmaster who came to the U.S. with his family in 1915, and a video called The Menongs of Agbayani Village. The second centers on a post made by the Filipino American National Historical Society that goes into greater depth on Filipino experiences of the Tidings-McDuffie Act and compares it to U.S. immigration policies in recent years.
Welcome to Lesson 2, Filipino Americans, Cannery and Farm Laborers. When the United States won the Spanish-American War of 1898, Spain ceded its long-held colony of the Philippines to the United States. Since the U.S. had annexed the Philippines, Filipino workers were initially exempt from the exclusion laws, a series of anti-Asian legislation that had recently slowed the flow of Chinese and Japanese workers, who often worked the menial jobs in canneries and seasonal farm work. Taking advantage of this special status, Filipinos began emigrating to Seattle in the 1910s, replacing previous waves of Chinese and Japanese workers. By the 1920s, some 3,000 were arriving annually to find work. Filipino immigrants at this time were almost all male and without their families, so these workers took part in the freewheeling Wild West of the day. Instead of gold, many of these young male immigrants hoped to earn an education. The International District in Seattle was the cultural heart of the Chinese, Japanese, and now Filipino workers. There you could see fashionably dressed young Filipino men exchanging news from the frontiers where they worked, going to films, eating at restaurants, and dancing and singing at the music halls. However, despite taking part in these characteristically American activities, Filipino workers, like the Chinese and Japanese before them, continued to be hired for only the worst and most dangerous jobs. In 1933, the Alascaros, who were Filipino cannery workers in the Alaskan canneries, founded the first Filipino-led union called the Cannery Workers and Farm Laborers Union Local 18257. Chinese workers in the same hard and dangerous situation had tried to unionize earlier without success. However, the Great Depression and the anti-Filipino race riots in the Kashmir and Yakamina Valley in 1827 through 1828, in which many Filipino agricultural workers were killed and their bunkhouses destroyed by fire, helped turn public opinion and allowed workers to begin to protect themselves through organization.
In this lesson, we'll be going over the Filipino-American enclaves from 1898 to 1946. Specifically, we'll be looking at the ones in San Francisco and Stockton. The goals for this lesson are to understand the economic, social, and psychological impacts of having these enclaves, but also learning how to advocate for these communities without turning into white saviors. The key terms obviously would be enclave and community, because sometimes those words can be used interchangeably. We'll also be going over the word Americanization and white savior, and Manila Villages, which is the essentially like Chinatown name label for Filipino American enclaves. The first activity in this lesson will be to look at this map as a whole class and really just discuss it and see what we can learn by just looking at this map. This is the Soma Filipinos, San Francisco Enclave, and there's a lot to it. There's a lot more than you would think. There's so many different landmarks in this small little area, and that's really interesting. The three discussion questions that I have for them are: what is the size of this map? Tell us about the community. What about the legend of the map? What does that tell us about it? And then also just to have a really open-ended discussion, what surprises the students the most about the map? Is it something that the legend covers? Is it something else entirely? I think it'll be a really good starting point for a larger discussion. The second activity in this lesson is going to focus on the white savior trope. The general gist of the lesson is for the students to think of a novel or movie in which there's a white savior trope, and how can they rewrite that to change it, and what happens when you do that? Does the message change? Does it stay the same? Is there something more important in this new lesson, if there is a new lesson or message from the rewrite? And the first couple of examples that I can think of off the top of my head were The Help, which is a very clear white savior trope movie and novel. Its main character is a white woman who is convincing black women to tell her their stories, even though there's a very, very real threat if it were to get out. And it comes across as though she's the one making the sacrifice for them. And it's very interesting to think about there. And then one, when I was doing my own research on this, came up was Isle of Dogs, which I didn't even think about. But there is an American exchange student. It's the young lady there with the blonde hair and the she's very clearly different from everyone else. She's very clearly leading this group of other students. But she is new. She's a white woman. She's a American, and she's putting herself into that sacrificial place once more. Obviously, this also happened with a white male lead, but the two examples I came across first were the white women ones. I'd be interested in seeing what the students would be able to come up with and how they would go about rewriting these plots.
This lesson will discuss the ways in which the Philippines' colonial status led to a Filipino-American community in the Washington, D.C. area that was distinct from Filipino-American communities elsewhere in the United States. The lesson will achieve this by focusing on the life of Vanjie Paredes, Washington, D.C.'s eldest Filipino-American resident. Paredes had a distinguished career in public service, working in the Resident Commissioner's Office, which later became the Philippine Embassy, and as a secretary for President Manuel Quezon, who led the Philippine government in exile in Washington, D.C. in the early 1940s. Paredes is one of many Filipino Americans who worked in the district's government sector during this time period, and she remains a pillar of the DMV's Filipino American community today. Students will achieve the lesson's learning goals through exercises that facilitate analysis of primary sources and recent articles on Paredes's life, including her career in the Resident Commissioner's Office and her volunteer work at Manila House, which was an important gathering place for Filipino Americans in the DMV. Students will also conduct research using secondary sources regarding the DC based resident commissioner's work to support the Filipino American farm and cannery workers on the West Coast.
Our fifth and final lesson in this series is about Filipinos in the United States Army. Some of our learning goals are to understand the experiences of Filipino veterans in the U.S. military through eyewitness accounts and use these as primary resources. From there, we will apply this eyewitness knowledge to the study of additional resources, including legislative materials such as bills that have been passed regarding the veteran status of Filipino veterans. We will develop these critical analysis skills over time in order to understand the legacy of Filipino veterans and some of the issues that they are still facing today and how these can be resolved. As we absorb this information and learn together as a group, we will view a compilation of interview clips from eyewitnesses, family, and scholars on why recognition for Filipino veterans is important. This comes from a part of the Philviet Rep organization's dutytocountry.org project, in which video clips of interviews from scholars, family members of veterans, and other prominent figures in the 20th century, and Filipino veterans themselves come together and explain the significance of the laws, the events, and the legacy of this history. The video to the right that you see is a video of a 100-year-old Filipino veteran receiving the Congressional Medal, which, as of only a few years ago, became an honor that Filipino veterans could receive. Finally, we will review historical and legal chronology of events in the 20th century through these lenses and get a better understanding of some of the circumstances surrounding these laws and the struggles that Filipino American and Filipino veterans faced.